Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Picking Pismo by Emmy Hilton. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. So, any idea of when you'll get your braces off? Asked Claire as she drove through the pint-sized town of Pismo Beach. The familiar shops of Claire's childhood faded into a sea of colors through her back window. Glancing in her rearview mirror, Claire caught Alexis's shrug. Throwing up a hand, Claire continued, "Take a wild guess." "How would I know?" hissed Alexis. Narrowing her eyes into tiny slits, Alexis flashed a directed glare. The car pulsed with catastrophic energy, almost combustible. "I'm only 13. After a dramatic eye roll, Alexis dropped her head back down, burying her attention once again in her phone screen. "I know you're only 13. Claire forced her voice to be even, refusing to let a 13-year-old rattle her. Though during the recent days it proved to be incredibly difficult. But I figured maybe the orthodontist mentioned it to you at your other appointments." "No," said Alexis in a vague whisper. Alexis peered out the passenger side window, pausing. Running a finger across the glass, she continued, "Mom always talked to Dr. Clark at the end." Whoosh. Mom. Claire's heart clenched tight and the air became stifling. Tugging at the collar of her shirt, Claire attempted to rid her skin of the restriction of her clothing. Eyes itching, she rubbed them to keep the tears at bay. Oh, how she wished Mom was still here. She'd know how to handle Alexis and her full-blown teenage fury. Honestly, the two sisters were practically strangers. Claire had left for college before Alexis even started grade school. When Claire came home to visit for the holidays, she usually took Alexis for ice cream or maybe a trip to the park. Then, after a few days, Claire would return to Los Angeles to her real-life job and friends. She now regretted not visiting more over the past few years, but hindsight was always 2020. Silence enveloped the car, only widening the distance between the two sisters. Biting on the inside of her cheek, Claire paused. If she misspoke, the headway she had gained over the last weeks with Alexis might take a major step back. Alexis was grieving, tiptoeing her way through the various stages of the grief cycle, coming to grips with her life never being the same without Mom in it. Sympathy wiggled its way into her heart. Alexis wasn't a bad kid, and Claire needed to recognize how grief sometimes manifested itself as anger. With a loud, wistful sigh, Alexis said, "I wish Mom was here." Her voice faded away. Then, almost as if a planned attack, her jaw locked and eyes narrowed. "Not you," Alexis hissed. Claire flinched. Blinking rapidly, she forced away the emotions bubbling to the surface. "Don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. This isn't about you, not directly. She misses Mom." Even though the insult was tangled up in grief, it still stung. Pushing her hair over her shoulder, Claire blew out a long, rattling breath. "I know," whispered Claire. After making a left into the parking lot of the orthodontist's office, Claire continued louder. "Me too, kid, me too. I miss Mom every day. I wish she was here too." Her shoulders drooped and the chest pinched tighter. Finding an empty spot, Claire parked. Immediately, Alexis jumped out of the car before Claire even turned off the engine. Alexis wandered into Dr. Clark's office, leaving Claire alone in the car. Claire slumped in her seat, trying to not let the feeling of defeat overtake her. Staring out the window at the orthodontist's office, Claire wondered if parents went inside and waited, or did she tell Alexis to text her when she was done? Pondering her predicament for a few moments, Claire climbed out of the car, walking to the front door. Claire needed to speak to the office about the payment of Alexis's braces. Nowhere in any of Mom's financial records did she find a remaining balance. Keeping her fingers crossed, Claire hoped Mom had already paid for the braces in full. Alexis's finances were tight enough, and Claire didn't think she could afford another payment if it was required. Maybe she could charge it, but then how would she ever pay it off? Their expenses seemed to be a never-ending list. Kids were so expensive. When Claire received the news of Mom's sudden passing, she took a 3-month sabbatical from her physical therapy job in Los Angeles. 3 months of unpaid time off. 3 months to pack up her sister and all their stuff, sell Mom's home, and bring Alexis back with her to Los Angeles. Apparently, years ago, Mom took a second out on the mortgage. Claire didn't have a choice. As much as it pained her, she needed to sell her childhood home to break even. Fast. Alexis was furious about the plan because her friends and life were in Pismo Beach. Many sleepless nights, Claire went over and over her budget. As much as she didn't want to uproot Alexis, financially, it wasn't possible to stay. The landlord of her apartment in Los Angeles refused to release her from the terms of their lease agreement, even after Claire explained the situation. So she'd let Alexis finish the school year, then they'd return to Los Angeles and try to build some semblance of a new life. Pushing open the door to the orthodontist's office, the door chimed as Claire entered. Glancing around the small waiting room, Claire didn't spot Alexis, so she peeked into the large communal exam room with a long row of dental chairs. Locating Alexis reclined in a chair with a dental assistant already adjusting her braces, Claire walked over to the reception desk. A woman in her mid to late 40s with curly brown hair sat behind the reception desk. She glanced up from her computer screen at Claire's arrival. "Good morning, I'm Sarah," said Sarah brightly. Her eyes sparkled kindly back at Claire. "How may I help you today?" Leaning forward on the reception counter, Claire fiddled with the cup of pens next to the sign-in sheet. "Good morning, Sarah." She bit her bottom lip. Claire continued. "My sister Alexis is here getting her braces adjusted." She let go of the pens and stood straight, adjusting her slipping purse strap. Interrupting her, Sarah wagged a finger at her. "I thought there was a resemblance. Sisters? What are you, like double her age?" Sarah scooted backward on her rolling chair, grabbing a file from the wall-to-wall shelving behind her. She swiveled back to face her, flipping through the file without looking up. Claire tucked some flyaway hair behind her ears. "You almost guessed right. We're 14 years apart." People were always amazed at the age gap between Claire and Alexis, especially with no other siblings in between. Alexis was a surprise. The day Mom told Dad she was pregnant, he took off and never came back. Dad never wanted children, so 2 kids was out of the question. Anyways, Claire shuffled her feet. "I needed to find out how much of a balance is remaining for my sister's braces." Glancing up, Sarah tilted her head to the side. "I'm sorry." Sarah shut the file in her hands and tossed it into a bin. "I can't discuss that information with you since you weren't on the account. Is your mom here?" Sarah glanced past Claire, surveying the waiting room. When Sarah didn't spot Mom, she reverted her gaze back to Claire. Claire took a deep, settling breath, bracing herself. "Our mom passed away suddenly a month ago. I'm now Alexis's legal guardian, so..." A pinch between her shoulder blades made her neck stiffen. "Could you let me know how much we still owe?" Sarah's eyes widened awkwardly. She shifted in her seat. "That's so tragic. I mean, how..." She waved a hand, looking away. Moving the mouse around, her computer screen lit back up. With a few more clicks of her mouse, Claire guessed Sarah was searching for Alexis's account information. She stopped clicking and met Claire's gaze. "I'm really sorry for your loss." "Thanks." Claire didn't want to elaborate. If she did, then the tears started, and sometimes they didn't stop for a long time. "So, about that balance?" Leaning over the reception counter again, Claire gazed at Sarah's computer screen. Holding up a single finger, Sarah said, "Let me go check with Dr. Clark." Abruptly, Sarah stood. "I'll be right back." She wandered into the exam room filled with dental chairs. When Sarah didn't return immediately, Claire opted to sit down and wait. Every inch of the coffee table was covered with random magazines. Mindlessly, she selected a magazine on top to occupy herself. Flipping through the Home Reno magazine, she closely examined a before and after photo. "Are you Alexis's sister?" a man's voice out of nowhere asked. Startled, Claire dropped the magazine right out of her hands. Bending down to pick it up, Claire slowly took in the dark-haired man with dimples. He wore scrubs with a white lab coat over them. Unconsciously, Claire smoothed out her own dark brown hair, thrown up into an untamable bun. If Claire knew Alexis's orthodontist's office had hotties walking around, she'd at least have combed her hair. Wondering if she had lip gloss on, Claire almost moved her hand to her lips to double-check, but she stopped herself in time. Yes, I'm Claire. Tossing the magazine back onto the coffee table, Claire stood. She even remembered to straighten her shoulders. He offered a hand. I'm Dr. Clark. A smile spread across his face, making her middle do a weird flip turn. Alexis is orthodontist. It's nice to meet you. His blue eyes dazzled back at her. Zero chance this guy was single. Claire wanted to do a ring check, but she forced herself to keep her eyes on his face. Likewise, I'm Claire, she stammered, then waved a hand. I mean, I already told you that. Fiddling with her purse strap, Claire waited for him to continue the conversation. She clearly forgot how to speak normally. Dr. Clark glanced over his shoulder towards Sarah. Claire caught the look they exchanged with one another. He wrung his hands together, shifting back to Claire. I understand you lost your mom recently. Yes, Claire paused, glancing in the direction of Sarah. I did. I mean, we did, Alexis and I. Sarah shrank into herself, darting her gaze away into her computer screen. Quickly, she moved her mouse around and started typing. I'm very sorry for your loss, said Dr. Clark. Sarah said you were asking about the remaining balance for your sister's braces. Kara managed to nod. Please, don't worry about what you owe. Dr. Clark waved a hand. I'd like to drop the remaining balance. Oh. Her gaze darted between Sarah and Dr. Clark. Claire glanced at her feet, then back at him. I mean, I can't let you do that. Just tell me the amount and I'll figure something out. A trickle of sweat dripped down her temple. Why was she sweating so much? It wasn't even hot. No, I insist. Dr. Clark's gaze skidded across her face. The worry lines on his brow deepened. Lowering his voice, he continued. I read what happened in the newspaper. I'm sorry. It's all so tragic. It's the least I can do to help. Claire sucked in the air. Her temples rang while sweat pooled at the small of her back. So he saw the article in the newspaper and made the connection. In a small town, nothing remained private, even the parts of life you didn't want to share. For the past month, Claire desperately tried to make sense of everything. Losing mom, wrapping her head around mortality. One minute you're living your life, then bam, everything crashes down on you. Mom, her bedrock, her solid foundation, was gone. With shaking hands, Claire forced them into the pockets of her jeans. Her eyes burned, a lump forming in her throat. Thank you, then. Her voice cracked. She averted her gaze, unable to look Dr. Clark in the eye for one more second. The emotions within her danced too close to the surface, trying to break free. 4 weeks in, Claire found ways to push them back down. Exhaling, she pleaded with herself to hold it together and not lose it in an orthodontist's office with a kind and unassuming man. We appreciate it. Dr. Clark gave a small nod. Okay, then. I'm finishing up with Alexis. His lips formed a crooked, tight smile. I'll come get you when she's ready. Then he left, returning to the exam room with its half a dozen dental chairs. Stunned, Claire stumbled back a few steps until she found her seat again. Slumping into a seat, she practiced her breathing method she learned in yoga. Mindlessly, she counted, waiting until her rapid heart rate returned to normal. Eventually, the tremor in her hands subsided too. She managed to remove her hands from her pockets and tightly grip them together on her lap. A few other patients came and went, giving Claire time to move her thoughts from grief to the kindness of strangers. If she learned anything through this experience, there was no shortage of goodness. Even with the unspeakable bad, the good far outweighed it. Goodness prevailed, and her little community in Pismo Beach overwhelmed her with their generosity. She whispered a silent prayer. Deep in thought, someone calling her name broke her trance. Claire? Dr. Clark appeared in the threshold between the waiting room and the exam room. Yes, Claire stumbled to her feet, eventually finding her footing. Why don't you follow me back? Dr. Clark motioned for her to follow him. Alexis's adjustment is completed. Claire wandered behind Dr. Clark into the communal exam room. Alexis was reclined in one of the dental chairs. Dr. Clark sat down on the swivel stool next to her. Grabbing some gloves off the side table, Dr. Clark put them on. Claire remained standing on the other side of Alexis. Dr. Clark asked Alexis to open her mouth, and Alexis complied. With his hands in her mouth, Dr. Clark pointed to a few teeth. I wanted to show you the progress. Taking a step closer, Claire leaned in to get a better view of Alexis's mouth. Her nostrils flared, catching a whiff of his cologne. Mind elsewhere, Claire didn't listen as Dr. Clark pointed and prodded at her sister's mouth. Claire wondered how long it took him to get his perfect 5 o'clock shadow. When Dr. Clark paused, looking over at her, Claire realized her error. Her cheeks flushed with heat. Claire scratched her head. Could you repeat that last part? I said, Dr. Clark turned off the overhead light, pushing it back to its proper place. She's on track to get her braces off in 6 months. Then he instructed Alexis to sit up, stripping his gloves off, revealing his bare ring finger. He tossed his gloves into the trash. 6 months? Squealed Claire. Realizing her overreaction, Claire cleared her throat and tucked some unruly hair behind her ears. I mean, is it possible she could get them off sooner? Claire didn't have 6 months. Dr. Clark stood, grabbing Alexis's medical chart off the side table next to the dental chair. He shook his head. I don't see that happening. Flipping through a chart, Dr. Clark double-checked the photos attached to the back. Then he snapped the file shut. It's like I showed you, there's still too much movement that needs to happen before Alexis can get them off. Claire pinched the bridge of her nose, forcing herself to calm down. We have to be out of Mom's house in 90 days. She gnawed on the inside of her cheeks. Scratch that, like 76 days. I don't... She threw her hands down at her side, trying her best to not spiral into a ball of stress. It was like she was on a child's teeter-totter, up and down all day long. The smallest thing pushed her almost to the breaking point. Things months prior she would have taken in stride. Hey, Dr. Clark's voice was warm and steady, loosening the knot forming in her belly. He tilted his head to the side. Let's not worry about any of that right now, okay? His gaze skidded across her face, making her heart palpitate. Hypnotically, Claire repeated, okay. Her uptick of stress dissipated. I'll worry about it later, she robotically stated. Alexis grumbled. Can we go already? Her gaze flicked between Claire and Dr. Clark. Claire paused, blinking. Yes, of course. Digging into her purse, she located her keys. If you want, you can go wait in the car while we finish up. She then held them out to Alexis. Snatching the keys from Claire's hands, Alexis said, fine. Then Alexis brushed past Claire, nearly making Claire stumble forward. With the chart in his hands, Dr. Clark stood too. Once Alexis was out of earshot, Claire said, thanks again for covering the rest of Alexis's braces. She shuffled her feet, moving toward the exit. My pleasure. His eyes crinkled around the edges. I'm sorry for what you and Alexis are going through. I can't imagine. His voice faded off, and Dr. Clark looked away. This was the part she hated. Claire didn't know how to put others at ease, and Mom's passing was like a dark cloud of gloom wherever she traveled. Instead of acknowledging his comment, Claire decided to pass it right on by. So, do I just talk to Sarah to schedule Alexis's next appointment? Yep. Dr. Clark placed the file in a box on a side table, then started toward a patient waiting in another nearby dental chair. We'll see both of you in 4 weeks. Then Dr. Clark sat down on a swivel chair 2 patients over and started speaking to the patient. Claire left, wandering to the front reception. She made the appropriate appointment with Sarah and left. After walking to her car, Claire slid into the driver's seat. With her earbuds firmly planted in her ears, Alexis didn't acknowledge her entrance. You didn't tell me, Claire started the engine. Your orthodontist was a total hottie. Alexis removed one earbud. What? Claire repeated. Dr. Clark is totally hot. Ugh, gag me. Alexis rolled her eyes and made a gagging motion. He's like super old. Gross. He's not that old. Claire glanced over her shoulder before backing out of her parking space. Then she slowly merged onto the street. We're probably only a few years apart. Exactly, Alexis scoffed. He's old. Claire refused to let Alexis get under her skin. She forced a laugh. Then that means I'm old too. Like I said, Alexis shifted, staring out her passenger side window. You're old. A long pause, then Alexis caught Claire's glance in the rear view mirror. How am I going to get my braces off if we're moving before then? We'll figure something out. Claire gripped the steering wheel. Her endless list of things to do before getting Mom's house on the market rattled off in her head. We'll drive back down if we have to, because Dr. Clark isn't making us pay the remaining balance on your braces, which is very kind of him. Everyone feels bad for us. Alexis shook her head, popping her earbud back into her ear. And they should. Our lives suck. Our mom's dead. You're stuck with me, and we have no parents and no money. Karate chop to the gut. Alexis's words knocked the wind out of Claire. I stammered Claire. The world came crashing down on her again, a whirling mess of tragedy. The past weeks of her life were ones Claire never wanted to relive. No doubt she had made 1,000 mistakes as she dealt with her mom's affairs and taken on the role as Alexis's pseudo-mother. She gazed to her right, taking in the view of the ocean, wishing for its calming presence to dissipate the tension in her chest. I'm glad we have each other, and I'm sure things will get better with time for the both of us. Even the words fell flat to her. Who was she kidding? Things were bleak. Both sisters thrown together due to horrible circumstances. A familiar weight landed on her shoulders, the burden too heavy to carry on her own. Claire paused and whispered a silent prayer. Alexis interrupted her. See, you don't even believe it. Don't lie to me. I see the train wreck coming. I wish I knew how good I had it before. She fiddled with her cell phone in her hands. Claire glanced at the rearview mirror, catching the sight of tears cascading down Alexis' cheeks. Her throat grew tight. I wish I had known too, Claire quietly replied. Silence. Then Claire added, things will improve. Her voice was a tad too cheerful. Promise. Swiping the tears away, Alexis pointed to her ear. I can't hear you. Then she turned up her music loud enough Claire heard it sleeping out of her earbuds. Letting out a long, raspy breath, Claire took the long way home. Getting a full view of the ocean, she opened the windows a bit to let the tangy salt water whirl around her car. Reminders of summers with Mom and Alexis whizzed through her as she remembered sunburns, saltwater taffy, and clam chowder. Her heart ached so much she found it hard to breathe. Maybe Alexis was right. What if things never improved? Perhaps this burden would forever be too heavy to bear. Give it to him. Claire paused, pushing back at the wave of overwhelming sadness engulfing her. God, it's yours, Claire stated out loud. It's all yours. The words drifted out the window, carried away with the ocean breeze. Claire took another glance at the beautiful ocean, and for a second, the gut-wrenching pain subsided.